This program has been made possible by the generous support of these organizations at Stanford University: Office of the Provost, Institute for International Studies, School of Humanities and Sciences, and Ambassador and Mrs. L. W. Lane, Jr., Donald L. Lucas, the Russell Family Foundation, Ronald P. Spogli. International Environmental Politics was offered to students at Stanford University as part of the International Policy Studies program during Winter Quarter 2001.
Okay, today I just want to go over the kind of logic of the kinds of papers we're going to be writing. Mainly, I won't do a lot on it. I'll set it up, and then I'll let you ask more questions. I mean, most of it you have in the article I wrote with Bernauer that you should have reread for today. Okay. The first part, in terms of doing the research, two big parts you have to do. Clarify what's the independent variable. In all your cases, I mean, going to the logic of the of the causal argument, I say, you know, in the steps to a convincing causal argument, you know, the 6 steps that we have in the paper, and I've got it as 8 in the lecture notes, but essentially they're the same. But clarify your question. And it better be a theoretically interesting question, meaning a question that's interesting to the community of people working on these issues as a whole. I've told you what that is, which is, did the treaty work or not? That is a question that remains interesting to people. But there's a lot of different variants of that. And what we might want to know is, why did a treaty work well with some countries but not others? Why did a treaty that had sanctions work better than rewards? Why did a treaty with sanctions work better in working, you know, with a fisheries, a tragedy of the commons versus a problem that wasn't a tragedy of the commons? There's lots of interesting theoretical questions like that. So you should read the books that I put on reserve, the science plan that's on reserve down in the IR department, lounge. Right? Everybody knows that there's 9 copies of the science plan down in the lounge. You should read that and just it gives you a good sense of what the lay of the land is. It's only like 80 pages or something. And it gives you a good sense of what general research questions are. I focused you in on one, but you now have to take that kind of general question of, did the treaty work, into a more specific question of, what about the treaty or whatever. So make sure you understand your independent variable. That also requires having kind of read the treaties you're interested in, knowing what did they do, knowing whether they had sanctions or rewards or some information strategy or something else. You know, what was, not just did the treaty work, but what was it about the treaty that worked? Again, the analogy would be, it's not, did Stanford make you more educated, but which part of Stanford made you more educated? And should Stanford, if they get a $5 million donation next year, should they spend it on faculty salaries, on hiring new faculty, on building better dorm spaces so that students get together and interact more late in the evenings and early mornings, because that's when the real education goes on. Right? I mean, we can think of the different reasons why Stanford gives you a good education. It might be because of the number of faculty. It might be because faculty have time to spend with students. It might be to take that $5 million and spend it to give incentives to anybody who gives up one more article of on their research and dedicates it to extra office hours, right? Because the real learning goes on in one-on-one office hours, or having dinners with students, between faculty and students. Who knows? But you have to sort out, what is it that Stanford's doing well that's helping provide a good education, and how are you going to take your money and spend it to get more of that to happen? Well, that requires that you understand what part of the Stanford education was the part that was the real value added. Because there's clearly some waste that goes on here. You know, there's some things that don't contribute to undergraduate education anyway. And how do you sort out the things that do contribute from those that don't? The other is to think about cases and case comparisons, and I'll use some examples of this in a second. But actually, I'll go through that extensively, the value of how you select cases and what they allow you to do and what they don't allow you to do. So that's the main thing. You have the lecture notes from today, and you should look through them. I think there are things like, you really should, when you write this is getting back down to the writing again, but when you write an introduction, you should say what you're going to argue. And I've never figured out the right English, I don't know the right words in any language, but I don't know them even in English, what the right words are for this difference between, this paper will analyze the Montreal Protocol. That's what most of you will write. That tells me absolutely nothing. Rather than, this paper will argue that the Montreal Protocol was effective at changing the behavior of developed states, but was ineffective at changing the behavior of developing states because it used sanctions for developed states and rewards for developing states. I just told you the whole argument. It's clear. And the great thing about having that argument is now you can evaluate whether I succeed at the task I'm setting out to achieve. Could you fail at the job of analyzing the Montreal Protocol? As long as you wrote about the Montreal Protocol, no, you were successful, right? There's no way to evaluate that other than say, yeah, that's what they set out to do, and they did it. They analyzed the Montreal Protocol. But give me an argument. And the value of laying out your argument up front is you know yourself whether you've met it. You've laid out, what's my goal here? When will you write that? In about week 8.5 or week 9. You won't know what it is until you've written it, okay, until you've written the whole paper. You'll have to, don't even try, I mean, you can try writing a draft of the intro, but you sure better go back and change it at the end. Background stuff, keep it short, okay? Like a page or two on definitions and background, but get on with the argument. You know, if you have to tell me, you know, what a regime is, give me a one-sentence version of what the definition of a regime is, and then move on. And don't give me the long history of your treaty. Give me the facts about your treaty I need to know in order to understand your argument. Not, you know, that, you know, this person did that to this person and all that stuff. Just get on with it. We'll talk about case selection, etc. then. So let's take the case. And so a couple of you have come in to see me. I hope to see the rest of you soon. Do come to office hours again. Office hours changed to Tuesday 2 to 5 instead of 3 to 6. But I will set up times with others to meet. More of you should, all of you should go see Tony Angeletta, since only about 4 or 5 of you were there, from what I heard from one of my RAs who was there. So 4 or 5, you know, everybody else should go see Tony Angeletta in the Social Science Resource Center and get help on how to do research. But I'm going to pick on this is the no good deed goes unpunished rule, which is if you come in and see me and talk about your paper, then I use your paper as a bad example of how not to do it, okay? So Kari was good enough to come in, but the advantage is she now knows it was wrong, not at the end when I just give her an F for the class, but rather early enough in order to actually make some corrections. So Kari came in and is talking about the OSPRCOM agreement. Oslo and Paris Commission basically takes care of the North Sea. Is that right? Yeah, okay. And she said, well, one of the things they did, one of the rules they had, was to try to prevent mercury contamination of the North Sea. Okay, so she thought, well, I can probably get data on mercury contamination of the North Sea. And all of you, I think it's a really important point. How many of you have science backgrounds? Okay, quite a few of you. The key point I want to argue is don't leave that outside this classroom. That there's basic science methodology that you should use here as well, and there's no reason to think that everything you learned in science classes, and even those of you who don't have science backgrounds, who took it in 7th, 8th, and 9th grade, biology or whatever, it's the same stuff. And it's, I mean, that's the only version I know. I didn't take science in, you know, when I was an undergraduate here. I took, you know, human sexuality and, you know, meteorology and sleep and dreams sort of stuff. So, but the basic model is, so Kari comes in and says, I want to look at whether this OSPRCOM agreement helped reduce mercury contamination, right? And so standard methodology. You observe actually, let's think about the logic of most arguments. What do a lot of arguments look like? A lot of arguments say, are that kind of design. We say, something happened, look what happened after it, isn't it awful, right? This is the NAFTA kind of argument, right? NAFTA happened in '93, we look at the Mexican environment in 1997, it's worse, NAFTA's a bad thing. What's wrong with that? We had a treatment in kind of science or science methodology types of treatment and an observation, right? X stands for treatment, O stands for observation. What's the problem with that, Eli?
Well, you didn't look at what the environment was like before. It
Okay.
might have been just as bad.
Okay, so what we need to do is another observation before, right, at a minimum, right? Better yet, that's two observations. What would be improve it even better? Observe, 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 right? And observe, 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 right? Because these are all non-treatment cases. What makes these the same is they're all treatments, they're all cases, observations, right, in which there had been no treatment. And these are all the cases with treatments, right? Okay, people following that part? Okay, so let's keep it simple though for now. So Kari goes out and she finds out that, we'll do this graphically as well. We'll say, when was the agreement signed, Kari?
1992.
1992. So we have 92 here. And she observes mercury contamination in the North Sea at that point. And what we know is, let's just say for the sake of argument, right, that here is some maximum level in the sense of that above this level it starts being harmful to species or to humans or whatever, right? So we're just saying this is we want to make sure that that it's below this level. So you see lots of articles, especially in kind of newspapers or environmental magazines that say, look at this, isn't this awful? Yes, it's awful. It is definitely awful that this is above that level. But that's not the kind of argument I'm asking you to make. Is this awful, right? You can make is this awful kind of argument somewhere else. Because I'm concerned about things that are awful, but what I'm concerned about is how do we fix them, okay? And so the question here is, did the treaty help make it awful or not, right? So, but you've all seen these kinds of arguments, isn't this awful? And people who go beyond that and say, isn't it awful? And look, this is worthless. This treaty is worthless, right? Is it a failure? Is this treaty a failure? Sarah?
We don't know yet.
We don't know. Well, do we know? There is one way it's a failure that we do know, right? If this is what it set out to do, it didn't do it. You set out to get an A+ in this class and you got an A, you're a failure. Because we know relative to your goal, you didn't achieve it, right? And part of what we mean by success is to say, did you achieve what you sought to achieve? No, you're a failure with respect to that. So one is, when we lay out success, we're always going to talk about two definitions. One is goal achievement. Did the treaty achieve what it set out to achieve? What would be the other? That's going to be far more important.
Movement along.
Okay, movement along. Movement along what?
Moving along in the right direction towards the goal.
Okay, movement in the right direction, movement towards the goal. What else would we want? Hanky.
Sustainability.
So, okay. Sustainability, good one, which might not be what they were trying to achieve, right? So what we want is, so good, what we want to do is have perhaps a couple definitions. For ease of use, we'll call them theirs and ours, right? What was their goal? Did they achieve their goal? And did they achieve our goal? And we can, what's the one problem with that, Hanky? If we know that most treaties are unlikely to achieve their own goals, how likely are they to achieve your goals? And why? Or why not? Are they more or less likely to achieve your goals than their goals?
Less likely to achieve my goals.
You're less likely to achieve your goals. Why? Because they're greedy corporate SOBs or?
Probably my goals are harder to accomplish in the first place.
Okay. And they weren't trying to accomplish yours, right? I mean, they may be easier, but they weren't. It might, I mean, it would be a nice world if this were true. It might be that achieving equity was easier than achieving sustainability, but they're not even making any effort towards equity, right? I mean, equity, if you wanted to achieve equity, if everybody in the world wanted to achieve equity, it'd be pretty easy to achieve, right? Whenever you made over $20,000, you'd give the next dollar to somebody else, right? Who wasn't. And you could, it's fairly easy to get equity, right? You just redistribute resources, that's pretty easy. But it's that we're not trying to do that. So and so in some sense we shouldn't expect it, right? But let's build on Sarah's, which is kind of, so this is all goals, and we can define these goals in 100 different ways. And for any treaty, there might be multiple goals, right? That we want NAF to increase economic growth, decrease environmental degradation, and increase equity. So we might evaluate it against all those three. Did economic growth, precisely because it did that, it caused more environmental degradation, and it didn't do anything about equity, right? So we could imagine it being, evaluated across a series of goals. But building on what Sarah was saying we want movement, we want progress. But somebody take the next round version of that.
Success in comparison to what could have happened.
Very good. Otherwise known as counterfactual success. How many treaties do we think, if we think about treaties in general, that is, if I think about when you guys all hand in your papers, I can probably create 3 types of piles. Or at least 3 piles of pieces of argument, because you might have several arguments within your paper. The first are treaties that were fully successful in terms of achieving their goals. Okay? Actually, there's a variety of different ones, but let's think this through. I'm not sure I want to do this. We've got 2 different questions. One is, did it achieve its goal? The other is, did it make a difference that was better than it would have been otherwise, right? So relative to what would have happened otherwise, was it better? So we started getting towards that. So Eli said, well, one of the things we need to know is what happened beforehand, right? And so he says, we go now, Kari looks before 92, right, and says, no, it was higher then, right? So Kari declares victory, walks off the field, says, look, this treaty was a great success. What?
It might have been going down anyway.
It might have been going down anyway, right? So let's think about the logic of based on that, why does it make some sort of sense to just declare victory and walk off the field? What's the because it's not the wrong logic. It's it gets the logic slightly right. It certainly gets it better than it did before, right? But it gets it slightly right. And what's the right part of that logic that says, okay, now we can declare victory? So Kari's saying that we want to compare it to what would have happened otherwise. So where's the connection between those 2 dots and what Kari just said? Emily, did you have an idea?
Well, you're getting towards the goal achievement, but you don't know necessarily if the treaty was what caused that.
Yes! Well, that's important, right? It's really important to know, did it cause it? Okay? So we're getting towards this goal, but it's crucial to know, did it cause it? Because, again, the logic I've been using with several of you during office hours is to say, all of you, if we want to declare that Stanford made a difference, all we got to do is measure your intelligence by some standard test when you entered, measure it when you leave, and take credit for everything that's different between those 2, right? And what's wrong with that logic is the fact that you're 4 years older, and hopefully everybody who goes to college or doesn't go to college, anybody who's alive, especially at your young, vibrant, intellectually stimulated, and curious age, is smarter 4 years later at the age of 22 than they are at 18. And they didn't all go to Stanford, right? The other way to think about it is, notice how many classes have you been in that tested you, gave you a test at the beginning of the course and gave you a test at the end of the course of the same material that you were going to learn in the course, to kind of see how much you knew about that material before you entered and how much you knew after. How many classes in all your classes here have you taken that gave you a pre-test and a post-test? You did, Eli?
Yeah, one.
One class out of you've taken a lot. And if we total all this, why don't you want to do that? I did it once in this class. Here's why you don't want to do it. Because the pre-test was 65%. The post-test was 85%. I taught them 20%. Much better to just give the post-test and declare victory of, hey, look at how much I taught them, 85%. Right? Do you see the logic that you already knew 65% of it before you even walked in the class? Now, I would want to probably write a better exam that captured more of that. What I would like to do is write an exam, because I'd like to know what difference it made. I'd like to write an exam that really got where you would get 0 on it when you entered, right? In order to measure how much did I teach you, right? But notice how we never evaluate teaching that way, barely, right? Because it's scary, and notice that same logic applies when you do policy. Why don't policymakers want to evaluate all their policies? They don't want to know they failed, right? Not good politics to say, yeah, we just spent $5 million on this program and it made this little difference. It made a difference, but it was this little, right? Okay, so we want to. So what is the value of having this second data point? How does it link to this counterfactual thing? Anybody have a guess? Why are we a little better off? We want to get at the counterfactual reasoning of what would have happened otherwise. How does this help us do that? Eli?
Well, I'm just thinking, I don't know if there's any more data points in between, but if it's sort of like a straight line in between them, then you can already see like the decline in general. But if it's like a...
We don't have that, though. So hold that. Well, that's the next step. So what do we get by just having this one extra data point? We do get an estimate of the counterfactual. Where is it? Kate?
At least we know the dot wasn't below the second dot. We know it didn't reverse the trend.
Okay, well, let's... What?
Just say the counterfactual is just...
Right. We have a counterfactual. What is it? What's our best estimate of the counterfactual given just this evidence?
Exactly the same.
Is this point over here, right? I'm going to use dotted circles as an estimate, right? We have an estimate of the counterfactual. In the absence of any other information, our estimate is that, right? We do know, right, I mean, so it's the reverse of this. This is, if we just make this graph, how stupid you are, right? How ignorant, we'll call it, it's a nicer word, ignorant. Well, how ignorant you were at 17, right? This is how ignorant you were at 17. This is how ignorant you are at 21. You know, here we know that this is our estimate of how ignorant you would have been at 21 had you not gone to Stanford, right? Then the logic of that shows, well, that would be silly because there's probably a trajectory of ignorance, right? So now we want to take Eli's point, which is why we want extra data points, right? So we look for data points like this. Actually, here, let's make it interesting. Right, okay. So this is what we'd like to see. Right, so we get those data points. Now what does it say? In the first case, we have this estimate of the counterfactual. And how confident are we? Not very, because it's only one. We estimated one data point from one other data point. Now we're going to estimate a data point which is the same year the counterfactual, right? But now we have 6 data points by which to estimate it. And it's up here, right? We would just draw the straight line on that and say, okay, so now, once again, so let's kind of, we'll have a moving target. Where's the success here? How do you measure the success? I want to make an argument that this was a successful treaty. What do I do? Eli?
We'd say if the treaty hadn't gone into effect, you'd have mercury levels up at the dotted circle, but instead you have down.
Here's the effect of the success of the treaty in a counterfactual sense. Where's the success of the treaty in a goal achievement sense?
Below that.
What?
Below that to the maximum level.
This part. This is the goal failure, right? And this is the counterfactual success. That make sense to people? Now I declare both. This treaty was both a success and a failure. It was a success, and it got a better world than we would have had otherwise, and it didn't achieve the goals we set for ourselves. Sir?
But can't we say that part of that counterfactual success is also part of goal success? Like moving it toward the goal?
Right. If you want to define goal success as moving towards the goal rather than achieving it, sure. Yeah, that's fine. And I mean, usually what we mean by counterfactual is at precisely that point. I would almost call that the counterfactual thing. It's movement towards. So that's one scenario. Let's take a different scenario. Again, where all we're changing is the way we still have this, the world hasn't changed, we still have those two original data points. Let's take that one. Now what's the counterfactual? It's, if you had data like that, what would it be called? Confirmation of what theory of IR? Realist theory. Treaties don't matter. States do what they're going to do anyway. No change, no impact. To put it in these terms, a realist theory of IR says the counterfactual behavior of any treaty is the behavior we actually observe. No difference between the two. Okay? So that's still, so a failure in that there was no counterfactual movement, right? And also still a failure with respect to the goal, right? Third option. And the cool thing is that you don't have to make it that your paper is a success regardless of which of these it finds. If it does a good job of showing that this is the truth, right? That this is the case. So here is so where's the counterfactual there? Down here, right? Had they left well enough alone, we would have been there. Okay? Yes, weird, but this was the Sudan case, right? Didn't I talk about the Sudan case of care at the beginning of the class, right? That they're saying number of deaths would have gone down had we not gotten involved with some food aid, right? So big failure here with respect to counterfactual, and a failure here with respect to goal achievement as well. Okay? Okay, so are people tracking that? Now, yeah.
So, but you can't be sure that that counterfactual point is actually what it would be. So, like, say there was something where, like, it was not possible for the mercury levels to, say the reason they're decreasing now is because companies have come up with better alternatives, and so they're using that instead. But then there comes to a point where you have to use mercury for something. So you don't know the validity of that counterfactual point. So possibly the treaty would have been is a success. Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
Okay.
So go.
It could have been like a baby mercury that's been on the way.
Right. Okay, there could have been a thermometer company, right, that was shipping a bunch of thermometers across the ocean, and all of a sudden it blew up because of a nuclear explosion nearby, you know, da-da-da-da, and there's mercury all in the water, right? Or all the fish in which you've had bioaccumulation of mercury have a little convention in the North Sea and die off or whatever, right? So you have a bunch of okay, notice what that is. It's saying that this thing, how many independent variables do we have in the story up till here? How many are we interested in? Malika?
We have just one.
One, it's the treaty. And we're thinking mercury levels are determined by treaties. That's our story so far, right? What you're saying is there is no world in which treaty levels are determined by mercury. It's one of several things that are influencing economic behavior in which mercury is part of that economic process, right? So we need to know, what we want to do is estimate this logic, right? In other words, estimate what mercury levels are like In fact, what we'd love to have is a nice econometric model of mercury levels in the ocean with no treaties in the world, right? We would like to have a model that estimated mercury levels over the last 500 years, including everything in the economic model about human economic activity, et cetera, so we can map it, and then we can track all the things that drive mercury levels, right? And map and have our little econometric model estimate this counterfactual without the treaty and compare it to what happened with the treaty, right? To basically use this. I mean, in a sense, though, we've captured some of that, right? What we haven't captured, so we've captured this. So one way to address this kind of problem, well, what if there was a big mercury pollution incident in the North Sea, and that caused things? What we've captured here is, in a sense, we've captured a trend of all the things. This trend line, embedded in that trend line, is all the economic things that cause it, right? So we've now limited the kinds of things we need to worry about to what? Things of what type? Accidents. What else? Malika.
The economy of Russia or someone close
So
by.
we have the economy of Russia is embedded in here somewhere, right? So what do we need to capture?
Future innovations.
Innovations, which occurred when?
Well, they're going to occur later.
Occurred in 1992 or later, right? We also don't really need to worry about innovations that occurred out here, right, beyond the point in time. We don't need to worry about innovations in here because they've been captured already in this trend line. We need to worry about things that happen more or less around this time. In this particular image, it's between this time and this time, right? Anything that happened in there that affects mercury levels that went through a change, right? It's not that the company that used to produce mercury is still producing mercury. It's that they're producing more mercury or doing it in a way that emits more into the North Sea or whatever, right? So you have to have changes in things, okay? So when somebody says to me, well, look, NGOs caused the success of the Rio conference, I'm saying you have to show me one of two things. You have to either show me that there were more of them just before the Rio conference, or that they were more effective just before the Rio conference. But there were NGOs around for a long time. Why didn't we have the Rio conference and all the environmental treaties that came out of that back in the 1970s when we needed it, when it could have made a difference, right? When it could have had an impact. So what was it that changed, right? If you're going to see change in a dependent variable, you better show me change in an independent variable, right? And this comes down. So this is part of it. So we've now got a process by which, let's go back to an easier one it just fulfills our need to believe that environmental treaties make a difference. So we've got some trend line like this. We have a counterfactual like that. Now, we want to try to capture, we're a little bit worried about this, this issue that some other things might have changed. So one way to deal with it is to make sure we have a trend line. That's why I've told you need 5 years before and 5 years after your treaty to kind of do data, because I want you to have a trend line. What's some alternative ways to make sure, again, we're trying to improve our estimate of this counterfactual, of what would have happened otherwise. Obviously, there's a string of counterfactuals, right? Because we don't only need one data point here. We can have a variety of data points, right? Because remember that what you could have here, the real graph, might well look like this is actually annual weather patterns, right? I mean, the real pattern on climate change, let's see. Look, this one is actually lower than this one 100 years earlier, right? So there's a lot of variation in the system. Is there still a trend? Yes. So you want to be able to capture that as well. But we're going to, so that's something else, just another thing to think about is that this might just be a year in which mercury levels, if they vary a lot, we would expect them to be down that year. Just by, who knows why mercury level. Actually, no, the good case of this is populations of animals, right? There's some animal populations that swing widely, right? And did before humans ever entered the picture. And so if we see that the deer population is up one year and down another year, we don't necessarily want to assume that that's a problem. That might be just natural variation. I mean, think about fires, right? Fires are a classic example of this. That the growth of manzanita forest, right? Or, you know, if you look at it over time, it's like this. Because fires clear it out, let it regrow. These are good things, and they're part of natural variation. Yeah.
What if you have two equally credible sources that are giving you dependent variables that you have no way to tell really which one is actually correct?
You mean two different estimates of the mercury levels?
Or attributed to two different factors.
Okay, let's just be clear about, okay, you said two different credible sources of the dependent variable, which would be two different estimates of mercury levels. If you say, but we could also have two credible independent variables, the things that cause it, which is what it seems like.
Either situation.
Okay, well, with respect to mercury, then you've got a problem. You've got to say, oh, we're getting different estimates of mercury. You should be able to make some sense. Hopefully, they're observing the same thing. And then usually what you find is they're not. They're observing, so tar balls, you know, if it was ocean oil pollution, it would be tar balls versus the amount of stuff that was emitted. You know, they're connected, that is how much gets emitted and how much shows up on the beach are connected somehow, but we don't know. We could expect them to be different. So that's on the dependent variable side. You just have to sort out either which is more credible or more often how both are credible but different estimates, right? One is your SAT score and the other are your letters of recommendation, right, from high school. Those are two different estimates of your intelligence and your likelihood of success at college. And they might be different though, right? So we could have a teacher who thought you weren't very good, even though your SAT scores were 1,600, right? So that's the relatively easy problem. The harder problem is this: what about two different credible sources, two different explanations of mercury stuff? So what we have here. So what's this? So Kari wants to tell a story that says the treaty caused the mercury levels to go down here, right? And she says, here's my counterfactual. What's the other credible source that you could have? Other credible explanation of a big decrease in mercury. Technological innovation. We find out that thermometers, that it's cheaper economically to produce thermometers with some other chemical other than mercury, right? They find some new little silicon. Oh, it probably is true, right? How do you get your thermometer? How do you get your temperature taken these days at the hospital? They shoot this little thing in your ear. I have no idea what it's doing, but I always feel like I'm dumber after I come out. They do this little thing in your ear that doesn't use mercury, right? So we should actually expect mercury levels to be lower, right? And so we want to find out is, did that occur in 92 or 97? And we'd also, if we were really going to pull the string on this one, we'd want to check, did mercury travel in ships across the ocean? Where is this mercury really coming from? We have to do a lot. But we've done all that, and we come to this, to Diana's point, which is we now know the story of how mercury gets in the ocean, right? And it's a story in which thermometers are traveling across the ocean. And what we find out is number of thermometers traveling across the ocean dropped drastically about this year because they came up with these little electronic temperature things, right? So we'd have to tell that story. So now we've just confirmed that there's two credible sources, right? Or two credible explanations of why there's a drop in mercury poisoning, right? Of mercury in the ocean, right? So that gets to what you're interested in, right, Diana?
Right, and also, each one, does a job of evaluating whatever their point is, and each one is biased in a certain way. You can evaluate a treaty in any, if someone really wanted to be successful and evaluate this data with their bias, just two equally but opposing.
Okay, that's one of the things I want to push you on, is because yes, people do that, and I'm trying to teach you a method that helps you not do that, helps you be more credible by being less a victim of your own biases. Okay? So, for example, let me hold that because I will come back to it. But that's precisely the issue we need to deal with, is you've got competing explanations of something, and we need to know which one is the real one. And it may be which 5 are the real 5 out of the 10 that are the explanation, and that's what it's, it's a complex world out there. People say everything matters. And what we want to figure out, some things matter more, some things matter less. Which are the things that matter more? Okay? So we've got this estimate. How can we improve our knowledge about our estimate of that counterfactual. So Kari, what was the example I gave you about what you'd really want to get?
You'd want to try to get 2 different countries or another chemical.
Okay.
To compare, like if that wasn't affected by the treaty.
Very good.
So that you could compare what it did after the Osborne Treaty and went into effect, and whether the mercury, because it was under regulation of the Osborne Treaty, decreased.
Okay. So what would be, like, let's just make things up a little bit here. What would be the best kind of, if there was a treaty you really wanted to evaluate, what would be the best thing you could hope for on the mercury thing? So let's say it regulates mercury.
There's another area that had mercury problems, but no treaty went into.
Okay. So one would be another area another region, right, of the same, maybe there were, the optimal would be there. Well, I won't even attempt to draw the map, but you have the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, right? And all the same countries are bordering them. They're all producing the same mercury, and the North Sea gets regulated and the Baltic Sea doesn't. And would we expect this? That is, and then we see the North. So how does that help us? Because we then have, let's see. So we're going to have the black is North Sea mercury levels, right? And the best would be, and this is Baltic Sea mercury levels, right? That's a good, nice way to say, hey, there's all these other things that drive mercury levels in an ocean for this set of countries, and and we see that they are unaffected. The treaty's the only other thing that can explain the difference, right? They kept going up in the Baltic and not in the North Sea. That's one option.
It seems to me like it'd be important to identify like the source, like the problem, not just like that there's mercury in the ocean, but like where is it coming from?
Right. Why? What's the value of understanding where it comes from?
You're comparing the two places of like you have the same countries that are in this area. There's 2 different bodies of water. But the problem is, well, you can't dump your mercury waste in the water.
Mm-hmm.
Then, they may like dump more waste into the Baltic because they're being regulated by the treaty to not do that. But if it's like emissions or something, then it's like still the same area. And then what you might have if you have to regulate emissions is decrease in both bodies of water, because
in order to solve the North Sea, to comply with the North Sea problem, they by definition also solve the Baltic problem. Right.
So
okay.
It seems like you need to know like where the source of the problem is, like why you would have different levels or why that would be useful or not.
That's why you're writing papers instead of just giving me a graph and calling it done. Because you want to tell this narrative story, right? This story about why it worked, how it worked, right? I can tell you correlational stories. I mean, the classic case, and it's true, is that you can find a very good empirical correlation between the number of the fertility rate, the number of children born to each woman in a community, and the number of storks in that community. Okay? Now, why? I can get you all to chuckle to that because why? Because of a correlational story? Because you've seen lots of data that show when you've adjusted for everything else? No. You have a causal story, right? Without going into in-depth. We do know that the last time we checked, the way babies come along, storks don't have a whole lot to do with it, right? And notice that it's also interesting in thinking about that. And I don't know what the exact numbers are. But think about, okay, so the real causal story is a correlational story which looks like, let me think about it. This says something about intercourse rates and baby rates, right? The number of, so here's the number of potential, or male-female interactions, and with intercourse, and the number of male-female interactions without intercourse, right? Over some period of time, or a certain group of people, whatever, right? And here's the number of babies that occur from both of those, right? The number of babies that occur from non-intercourse events is 0, right? You never have a baby come from non-intercourse. Well, if you're a Christian, you might believe there was one of these. But other than that, right? The number of non-intercourse events, so non-intercourse always leads to non-baby, right? But intercourse doesn't lead to babies, and not even very frequently, right? That is, even, I mean, forget even birth control in here. The odds of having a baby are fairly low for people, right, over the period of time. So, but if I had just given you this and said, this is X and not X, and this is A and not A, does X cause A? It sure does, right? A never happens if you haven't done X. X causes A, but on a probabilistic basis. X causes A 1 out of every 10 times. But it's a perfect cause. It's just a probabilistic cause, right? But do we, I mean, if I said, no, intercourse doesn't cause babies, you would just laugh, right? Intercourse causes babies on a probabilistic basis. There's never a case up here, right? So I think it's important to think about that. But the reason we do it is not because of a correlation matrix like this. It's because we have a causal story. Again, that's exactly identical to the argument that the tobacco industry has been making up until a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. They said, you give me a correlation like this, but I don't believe it because there's not a causal story. What was the causal story that came out finally 2 years ago? You had correlation stuff that people who smoke get cancer, lung cancer. What happened 2 years ago? They showed the mutations that happened from nicotine getting in the lungs. They showed the causal pathway, okay? And all of a sudden, they kind of had to buy in. They couldn't just say, it's just a correlation. And so, I mean, to get back to the storks and babies, what you really have is a problem of, not a problem, but here's ruralness that causes fertility rates, and that causes storks, right? That is, in rural areas, there's more storks. There's not a lot of storks the last time you were in downtown Manhattan. Not a lot of storks there. And it also turns out, for a variety of causal reasons that are fairly complex, ruralness causes higher fertility rates, and urbanness causes lower fertility rates, related to things like education, alternative forms of entertainment, etc. So, I mean, just to keep you thinking about these notions of that we want to tell a causal story, not just a correlational one. But you've got to have the correlation there first, right? You have to have some degree of correlation there first. Okay, so now, but what the short form of what Kari just suggested is that we have that as our study design now, right? Observe something with a treatment, observe the same thing without a treatment, and compare. Why? Because this gives us an estimate of a better estimate of the counterfactual. Rather than using this for the counterfactual, we use this for the counterfactual. Do you see how there are two different ways to get at the counterfactual? Right? Now we have a lot more confidence in this being the counterfactual. We actually have two estimates of it, right? We use the trend line to estimate it once, and we use the trend line from the other chemical to do it a second time. Okay? And both ended up it just confirmed. Now, if these had been different, we wouldn't need to worry about it. The third is to get something for the other counter evidence. To go to Diana's question directly, let me see if I can think about how to draw this properly. Okay, this is from my dissertation and book. Here's the number of ships that have a certain technology. It's called segregated ballast tanks, okay? This is 1978 when they started, when they were required. Most ships didn't have them, although some did early on. It's required by international law. They have to achieve it by this date. You know, it goes into force in 78, and they have to achieve the compliance by 82 or something like that, right? And this is the graph we see. And somebody says, yeah, but that has to do with the price of oil going up. This segregated ballast tank was designed to reduce oil being dumped into the ocean. But oil companies would have strong incentives not to dump oil into the ocean intentionally if the price of oil went up, right? It's only if the price of oil is really low that they just dump it overboard to clean out their tanks. I mean, I can tell you the whole story of that, but there's basically a reason why well, when you get down to Kuwait, you have oil from Kuwait. You go to New York, you discharge it, right? You dump it, you give it to the oil company that bought it, right? Then what's your ship doing? It's riding high in the water, right? Because there's nothing ballasting it. So you take on seawater as a cheap form of ballast. You just pump water from the ocean into the tanks where this oil was. You should go across the ocean. You get back to Kuwait. On your way there, just before you get into port, you say, oh, I got to get this water out so I can get new oil on. Well, the water happens to be mixed with a little bit of oil that was sticking to the sides of the tanks. So all that oil, that little bit of oil, gets dumped overboard. It turns out a little bit of oil, like 0.3% of a tank out of a 100,000-ton tanker, is 300 tons per shipload, per trip. So it's a lot of oil. But you could say, well, that 300 tons, if that's a lot of money, they'll figure out some better way to deal with this. And so they did this tanks crude oil washing system that saved them money. And so the alternative explanation is it wasn't the treaty, it was the price of oil going up in 78 that did this, right? That caused them to create it. So we might have two explanations. One is the price of oil caused this increase in the use of this technology, and the other is the development of the technology, right? I mean, they might not have had it because the technology wasn't available. So one thing we have to do is look for the story, and so you say, I better find out when was crude oil washing available, right, in a segregated ballast tank. We find out it was available back here. They could have done it, okay? So we just eliminated that hypothesis. And then somebody says, but it's still the price of oil, because the price of oil went up in 78, right? Well, we say we're going to map the price of oil then too, just to check. And we look at another map, and we find that the price of oil was like this, spiked in 73, spiked in 78, and then flattened out again, went back down again. And so first of all, we have two pieces of evidence that work against us. First of all is that, three pieces. One is that they had crude oil washing available and they didn't use it here in response to this. So it suggests, in general, price of oil doesn't affect their behavior that much in this. You know, the technology was available, they didn't use it. Here again, and if so, then this should have been much sharper up. And they also should have taken it back off. But this is a technology you can only put on. You can't take it back out again. But the other thing is, the other part of why you want to tell a causal story is there was an alternative strategy called load on top. I won't go into the details, but the bottom line is it was much cheaper and would have allowed them to save the oil, a way to save the oil here and then go back to their old ways again without installing expensive equipment, okay? So just to say that's the way you say, okay, what is the rival hypothesis and can it do a better job or a worse job explaining than mine? So I was able to say, the price of oil can't do a better job than the treaty in explaining this behavior. Okay? So that's the way you kind of address those things. A couple of last points. I want to end on time here because a couple of people have an exam to go to. Just picking, I guess the basic point is picking other cases that allow you to compare. And I think it's important to realize when you're picking your cases to say, what can you tell from the cases you pick? So and there's several different ways Kari can do it. Kari can use this, she can look at, hey, what was the mercury levels coming out of Germany versus coming out of France. Okay, she could, if she had data on where the emersions were coming from, she could compare Germany to France, right? And if she found differences between those, and both Germany and France are regulated under the treaty, what can she say something about? Can she say something about the effectiveness of the treaty?
The treaty wasn't really doing anything. The mercury levels were changing.
Well, it depends on the comparison between the two countries, right? If France and Germany both change in the same way, we have, what are our two cases in that case? Let's just take
One of them was actually following the regulations of the treaty, and the other one wasn't.
Okay, well, let's get to that case in a second. Let's just, for starters, pick Germany. Do we have, if we look at Germany, of the effect of the treaty on Germany, do we have two cases? Yes, before and after, right? A case is just an observation. So if you have Germany before and after, that's two cases, the case of Germany before and the case of Germany after. Now we've got four cases, Germany and France before and after, right? And what if we see both of them, completely eliminate their mercury emissions, then we can say the treaty made a difference if we dealt with the counterfactual in better ways, right? But then what if we see that France mercury emissions continued the way they were and Germany's dropped off dramatically, and we know that Germany's dropped off because of the treaty, then what kind of argument do we have to make? That there's something different about the treaty? So we now see differences in the response to the treaty in two different countries. Where does that difference where does that explanation have to be? Well, it was because of the sanctions in the treaty. Can that explain it? Why not, Eli?
Well, if they're both under the exact same sanctions, you probably have to look for something inside the country.
Very good. We have to look for variation that goes with where we see the variation across our cases, right? We see one country responding differently than another country to the same input, right? The same independent variable, the treaty. Same independent variable can't cause different responses in different countries. At least if it's the same, it has the same force on the different countries. In the Montreal Protocol case, for example, you could have that if you were comparing two different countries, a developed country and a developing country, because the developed countries have different rules than the developing countries. But if they're all among the developed countries, if you see a difference in the two countries, you have to look for it in the country itself. Why don't I spend the last 5 or so minutes just getting questions. I mean, I think the main thing is thinking about how do you find cases, variation across, which help you get at some of these questions. So if you see a possible alternative explanation, pick another case that will allow you to eliminate that as a source of explanation. Well, if we wanted to say, so for example, say an alternative explanation is just, we have a story that in the oil pollution case, right, we initially have some data that says all these European states complied, right? And then somebody says, well, it has nothing to do with the treaty. These countries were going to do it anyway because they're good developed countries and they had big green movements, that were pushing them to get greener, right? Then what's the good case to select? So you want to get rid of this alternative, you want to make an argument, or you want to evaluate whether it's the treaty or the green movement that made the difference, right? What would be a good case to pick then?
This is a different, push by the green community that didn't result in that kind of compliance by the government. I mean, I would guess.
Okay, you're near, but what's a better solution? Kari and then Eli.
Another country that was under the treaty but didn't have such a strong green movement.
Okay, Eli? Same? Okay, you keep repeating other people's points. But yeah, you want to pick a country that doesn't have the green movement, where the independent variable was not changing, or was not, couldn't have had the effect. And then see, and if in that if in that country that didn't have a green movement, they still comply, we can say, hey, it doesn't matter whether you have a green movement or not, the treaty makes a difference, right? So it's working through that logic. And I think an important thing to notice in some cases is, so if somebody says, compares, let's say, what would be good? Compares Spain and Italy, and says the reason that Spain complied with the treaty and Italy didn't is because Spain is a very Catholic country. What's your response?
Italy is pretty darn Catholic country.
Italy is Catholic too, so it can't. There's obviously something different between Spain and Italy, but the difference is not their Catholicness. So that it's their Catholicness and their rule-abiding behavior because of their Catholicness or whatever the logic would be there, right? It can't explain the difference in outcomes because you have the same input, right? So that sometimes some of the interesting cases of this are, you have a lot of the literature, some of you may have read Carol Gilligan's In a Different Voice, and a lot of the literature on the learning of young girls. What's the one problem with the arguments about learning among young girls? A lot of case studies. Problem is they never compared it to boys. That all the problems with how girls learn may be true, but they may be visited just as much on boys. I mean, and that's overstating the case about Carol Gilligan's work, but in general, a lot of that research has been done without looking at comparison to boys, and yet saying it's because of gender, and it's based on girls. So, and part of that can be because you have this generic story about how boys are treated in society that has been developed, and so you want to develop the stories of how girls learn. But for good social science, you want to say, are boys treated differently than girls in society? And then how does that difference account for why women don't do as well at science or whatever the arguments are going to be, right? So you want to be careful about that, and then you want to just keep being careful about what your cases allow you to say, okay? And so a good thing to come in when you come talk to me is say, here's some cases I'm thinking about. Am I thinking about them well in terms of what they would tell me about the treaty and the other sources of variation? Last question or two. We have a few more minutes, but any questions about how you're doing your cases or stuff? Does this all make sense? I mean, that the key thing is trying to get at this counterfactual. That's really the key thing, is how do you estimate that? How do you know what would have happened otherwise? Go back to the It's a Wonderful Life stuff, right? It is understanding what would have happened in the world without Jimmy Stewart. But that's hard to do. It's incredibly hard to do. It's so hard to do that most people don't do it, and those who do it don't do it very well. And that's, if you can get that from this class about how to move towards that goal. And going back to the goal achievement versus counterfactual, I expect no goal achievement in this class in terms of really getting how to do counterfactuals well. But I will expect you to get closer to it than you would have if you hadn't taken the class. That's what I'm hoping for, is that you'll know better how to make a strong argument than you would have without trying this. So I really want to push you to think about it. And if you need to, think about it in fairly simple-minded, scientific terms, right? Too simplistic for now. And then add the complications of the fact that there's 15 other things going on in the world. The world is complex. Add that in after. But get the kind of simple story right, to say there's Diana's raised a good point, which is there's 2 or 3 important factors, and we need to know which ones matter. Maybe they all do, but there's ways to sort that out. And even if they all do, the question is it an and or an or, right? That you need a Green Party and a treaty? Or can you get it without a treaty but with a Green Party, or get it with a treaty without a Green Party, right? So if you had those two, you got 4 combinations that it can't ever happen, whether you have a Green Party or a treaty. You can't get environmental compliance without a Green Party or a treaty. You can get it with a treaty but not a Green Party. You can get it with a Green Party but without a treaty, or you need both, right? So that's a nice way to try to work with alternative explanations. But to do that, you have to set up cases that allow you to get at that. And so we can go through. The more alternative stories you tell, the more cases you have to get at it. There's, in fact, a direct relationship. That you actually need the number of variables you have plus 1 at least to be able to get at that question. But I mean, that's sort of a technical part. But the basic point is, the more treaty theories you want to test, the more cases you'll need.